This is our friend Sush Dobzhansky. It's on the Chilean-Argentine border pointing at a statue of Christ, I think. But he pointed out a lot of other things, including famously in his 1973 paper for the National Association of Biology Teachers, that nothing in biology makes sense except in the light of evolution. And despite this 35-year-old warning about the importance of teaching evolution as this organizing principle in biology, challenges to the teaching of evolution continue to grow today. And as E.O. Wilson and others have pointed out, the 21st century is really setting itself up to be the century of biology in a way that the 20th century was a century of physics, at least in economics and geopolitics. So the fact that we're not teaching evolution, that there are these challenges, poses some real challenges to America's economic future, among other things. You know, Dobzhansky was clear about the importance of teaching evolution, but so are lots of other people. We've collected in Voices for Evolution, which is an NCSE publication, hundreds of statements from hundreds of scientific societies, including the AAAS, but lots of others, as well as educational groups. Don't try to read it. It's going to go by too fast. But educational groups, civil liberties organizations, and religious societies, all explaining the importance of teaching evolution and the dangers of presenting creationism in the classroom. If you didn't see your professional societies listed in there, or if you go to that URL and don't find it there, encourage your society to come out with a statement like that. It's really valuable to have these things so that people, when a challenge comes up in a community, someone can say, look, my professional society has come out with this consensus statement about how we view biology, how we view the importance of evolution. And statements from religious groups are in some cases even more valuable, so those of you whose religious groups aren't represented there, please do that also. Other endorsement of Dobzhansky's maxim comes from another project of NCSE's stating that evolution is a well-supported unifying principle in biology, that creationist pseudoscience doesn't belong in science classrooms. And we've been circulating this for a couple of years now, and we've got 1,000 scientists who signed on with this, which doesn't really sound like that much when you get right down to it. I mean, really. We started this as a response to sort of gently mock creationist petitions about, oh, we've got 700 scientists who question Darwin. So we restricted the number of people who could sign this to Steve's. This is partly in honor of the late Stephen Jay Gould, and also it's just to point out the silliness that you can construct a weird list and get a bunch of people to sign almost anything. But you know, there is a serious point here. Census records show that Steve's, Stephanie's, Istvans in Turkey represent something like 1% of the U.S. population, which, if you extrapolate 1,000 Steves out to the entire scientific community, that's 100,000 scientists who have stood up for this, and including such luminaries as Stephen Hawking and Energy Secretary and Nobel Prize winner Stephen Chu, and our 1,000th Steve, who we announced last Friday, Steve Darwin. Despite these eminent endorsements, the teaching of evolution is still in a lot of trouble around the country. Over the last 5 years, you can see the map evolve from 2004 on, from 9 countries around the world and around 30 states in 2004 that we were actively monitoring creationist activity in those states, to, in the last 5 years, it's up to 48 states in that time period that we've been tracking creationist activity, and 19 countries. The 2 remaining states are South Dakota there and Hawaii. And any of you who think that South Dakota is some sort of bastion of great evolution education, I've got a Bigfoot ranch that I'd like you to invest in. And part of the challenge with this is that it is a self-reported thing. A lot of what we do at NCSE relies on our members or concerned members of the public coming to us and saying, hey, my kid came home with this creationist pamphlet that the teacher's handing out, what do I do? So it's a very self-selected sample, and if no one in a community has a problem with creationism in the classroom, if no one in the community is saying, why isn't my kid's teacher teaching evolution, we never hear about it. Things can go on for, something will come to our attention that for decades has been going on. And finally, someone comes in and says, wait, what's this all about? So, it's good for those of you who are, especially in smaller communities, be keeping track of what's going on in the schools, because there are 16,000 school districts. It's hard to keep track of what's going on in all of them. And because of this, I'm not too confident that Hawaii is an island paradise of evolution education either. And part of that is also because surveys show that there is a lot of pressure on teachers not to teach evolution. An informal web survey by the National Science Teachers Association in 2005 found that 30% of science teachers reported getting pressure by their administrators, by parents, or by students not to teach evolution. And 31% in that survey reported pressure from administrators or parents, 31% to teach creationism. Similar, more scientific studies on a state level have found similar results. So even though that's, again, a self-selecting sample, it matches up pretty well with what seems to be true nationwide. And it's also borne out by a study that was published in early last year in PLOS Biology, which found that about 1 in 8 high school biology teachers spend at least an hour promoting creationism, advocating for creationism. And an equal number spend at least an hour explaining what's wrong with creationism. And presumably in response to this pressure that they're feeling from the community, that why aren't you giving equal time to both sides? That same survey found that about a third of teachers spend 5 hours or less teaching evolution. And as you see, the modal value is 5 to 10 hours, which is about 2 weeks, between 1 and 2 weeks of instructional time on evolution. This is nowhere near enough for what we know is the foundational principle of modern biology. There's no way that you can cover everything that needs to be covered and get the detail of evolution that students need if they're going to understand modern biology in that little amount of time. And in fact, surveys bear out that students are not coming away with a good understanding of evolution. Over the last 30 years, Gallup has been asking basically the same polling questions. What do people think about the origins of humanity? And the variation here is basically within the margin of error over the last 30 years, with some sort of creationism getting support about 40%, and evolution either with or without some sort of theistic involvement combining to cover the rest. And this is despite huge scientific advances and improvements of our understanding of evolution over that time period and, of course, over the last 150 years. The National Science Board has done similar surveys, and again, you find basically flat, persistent 40%-ish support for evolution of humans. This is contrasted with an also evolutionary idea of continental drift, which enjoys about twice as much support, even though it's a younger theory. And the earliest evidence for continental drift came from fossils, from evolutionary evidence, and trying to explain how does this work? Why do you see the same fossils on different continents? Those surveys also show something important about that public education campaigns on scientific issues can work. Over the last, again, 25 years or so, the public understanding in the United States of the fact that antibiotics don't kill viruses has increased pretty substantially in response to education campaigns. Don't use antibiotics because you have a cold. It won't kill the virus. And at this point, there's actually higher understanding of that in the United States than there is in Europe. That sort of suggests a model for evolution education, perhaps. Understanding of evolution, though, doesn't follow that same trend. Genie and John Miller and Shinji Okamoto in 2006 published a paper in Science looking at an international survey of how people understand evolution. And out of 34 industrialized nations surveyed, the United States came in 33, ahead of Turkey, behind scientific powerhouses like Cyprus and the Slovak Republic. This is not where we want to be as we're preparing students to be the scientific innovators of tomorrow, the Nobel Prize winners, and so forth. The same worrying trends show up when you look at 4th and 8th grade understanding of science. This is a bit of a jumble, but I'll put the names in slowly so you can follow along. But the trends in mathematics and science study has, over the last 10 or 15 years, been doing these standardized tests across lots of different countries around the world of 4th and 8th graders. This shows 8th grade results, with countries like Korea and Japan, major scientific powerhouses, at the top, as you'd expect, The United States comes in barely edging out Lithuania. This, again, these students are our seed corn. They're going to be the Nobel Prize winners of tomorrow. Tomorrow's economy really rests on their scientific knowledge, and we're at risk of losing our edge if we don't solve the problem that this cartoon so ably points out. And Dobzhansky had part of the solution. He was writing for the American biology teacher for a reason. He wanted to remind them why evolution has to be central to a modern biology class, in particular the importance of presenting common ancestry as this organizing, explanatory process. When students say, oh, there's too much memorization in biology, not if you're presenting it in this context of evolution. Without evolution, Dobzhansky pointed out, biology becomes a pile of sundry facts, some of them interesting or curious, but making no meaningful picture as a whole. With that sort of background, how can students be the biotechnology leaders, the doctors of tomorrow? And the rest of the panelists are going to go into this, and I'm not going to presume to know more about any of them than almost any subject in biology. So what I'm going to argue is that, in fact, Dobzhansky was understating his case, that evolution makes sense of sciences that Darwin and Dobzhansky could never have imagined. For instance, the cancer treatment Taxol, which is derived from an endangered species of yew called the Pacific yew. It's a very slow-growing tree, and the compound was isolated from the bark, which means that to harvest it, you have to strip the bark off the tree and kill it. When they were doing the research on this, they could barely get adequate supplies to do research on the drug, let alone for a full course of treatment, which for one patient would have taken the bark from 300 trees. So, smart pharmaceutical chemists sat around and they said, there's clearly too little Taxol from this source. What do we do? Chemically synthesizing it from scratch was 50 or 60 steps, way too much. So, they thought about common descent. The Pacific yew is related to other species. The same genes that produce Taxol in the bark of the Pacific yew exist in some related form in other yew trees. And they found it, in fact, a precursor chemical that in one or two stages in the lab, you can synthesize into Taxol in the European yew, which is a widespread ornamental tree, and you're using the needles which you can harvest fairly sustainably. Doing that gave you lots and lots of Taxol that you could give, which Bristol Myers Squibb got over $11 billion in sales out of it before it went generic in 2004, and more importantly, since then it's saved hundreds of thousands of lives. Evolution saves lives. Evolution also has done good things for General Electric. They've been using it to keep profits, and it's not a Barrett-Carrier flagellum. It's in fact a jet turbine. So using a computer model to mimic the way evolution works, the process of mutation and selection and recombination, they were able to come up with a design for a jet turbine that was in fact 3 times more efficient than anything that human designers, very intelligent designers, were able to come up with. Moving on, rocket scientists are using similar techniques to come up with, in this case, these look like just little bent paper clips that someone was doodling with while they were on a long phone call. But these are antennae that are on a satellite that's orbiting Earth right now as a test bed for new technologies. They're hoping to use antennae like this on missions to Mars and other planets. They were evolved using similar computer algorithms and are lighter, more efficient, and draw less power to send the same signal than anything that human designers were able to come up with on their own. Electrical engineers need to understand evolution. I could go on, listing examples of hedge funds that are using evolutionary algorithms to evolve virtual stock traders who do better than their human analogs. I could talk about oncologists who use their understanding of the evolution within a single patient of new strains of cancer in response to treatments to understand and to short-circuit that and to treat and prevent cancers. I could talk about how electrical engineers working on the ubiquitous USB thumb drives are using evolutionary techniques to make them last longer. And indeed, these seem to be evolving camouflage. Just last week in Nature, there was a report of chemists who had come up with a crystal, who had, using evolutionary algorithms, had discovered a crystal alignment of boron, a new form of elemental boron that's nearly as hard as diamonds, and then based on their computations, synthesized it in the lab. chemists need to know about evolution. Cosmologists are using evolution as an inspiration for how universes themselves might spawn further iterations of themselves, slightly mutated, and that certain sorts of universes might be more likely to spawn other universes. This is evolution of universes. But the last example I want to bug you about is something called integrated pest management. This is an increasingly important agricultural technique that helps farmers produce better food using fewer pesticides by using their understanding of evolution, by trying to apply pesticides only when it will have the least selective impact on the pests, but have the maximum impact on the food supply. They also use naturally evolved pathogens, parasites, and predators and competitors to try to reduce the number of pests in a given field, increasing yields and reducing the amount of toxic chemical that has to be put on. So understanding the evolutionary history of these pests and pesticide resistance, host-parasite co-evolution, and the evolution of life histories helps farmers grow more food at less cost and less harm to the environment. And I'm emphasizing these examples over a host of others that I could give for two reasons. First, as evolutionary biologist, biotechnology entrepreneur, and astrobiologist Steve Benner told me a while back, you can make money on evolution. You can lose money when your actions are premised on a denial of evolution. This is an important point. I bring it up with school boards. It takes people back for a moment. But also, evolution is not just for biology. It doesn't just belong in biology classes. And it's not just for biologists. Biology majors aren't the only ones who deserve an introductory course in evolution, which is not to say that evolution shouldn't be a major part of undergraduate biology education. For those of you who are college professors in biology, if your biology majors don't have a required evolution course, this is a problem. And if your introductory classes don't use evolution as an organizing principle already, that's also problematic. I know at KU, when I was there, they was in the midst of a process of reworking the curriculum to bring evolution more centrally into it. And it helped students. And certainly as we enter a century where biology is really going to be the central science that people interact with, that is core to the economy, to geopolitics, even non-scientists are going to be expected to have some understanding of how evolution works. And David Sloan Wilson at Binghamton and other universities have been working on ways to run evolution not just through the science curriculum, but indeed through the whole college career. Students deserve this sort of knowledge because whether they're going to be applying IPM as farmers, advising a loved one with cancer, developing thumb drives for the future, electing school boards, sitting on panels that set funding levels for NSF and IIH, they have to understand what evolution is and why it matters. And if you want more information about the programs that they have at Binghamton, that's a URL you can go to. Now, as scientists, there's a lot we can do to reach out to students, to parents, and to teachers. It's important to talk to the press about why evolution is important, about what our research is, about how science works. It's important to talk to school boards and to talk to legislators about why evolution is central to modern biology, why it doesn't deserve to be singled out in the curriculum, why legislators shouldn't be coming after it. And, at the end of the day, everyone needs to know this. It's worth volunteering in local schools. It's worth, even if you're not teaching high school science, it's worth remembering that your students are likely to be the high school teachers of tomorrow. The evolution preparation that you give them as college students is going to help the next generation of college students also. And this is borne out by studies. That same 2008 survey found that teachers who study evolution in college spend up to 40% more time on evolution in their classrooms. So, for those of you who are at schools with teacher education, pre-service training, a required course in evolution is not a bad idea for biology teachers. But there are other things outside the classroom. Things like science cafes that I know there's been a lot of talk about here at the meeting. Science blogs. I have a science blog. That's how I got involved in all of this, for better or for worse. Wikipedia is always after subject experts, and it's the fount of all knowledge. People turn to that for information. If your field is underrepresented there, it's worth getting involved in improving the quality of it. It can also even help you get publications. There's a journal that is now requiring a Wikipedia entry before they will publish your peer-reviewed research on RNA. Sites like SciV let you post slideshows, let you post your posters and audio commentary on them, or audio commentary on papers. There are talented scientists who are putting YouTube videos up describing their research for non-specialists. Jay Hosler, who's a biology professor at Indiana University, draws comics about evolution. And there are a host of other ways that people can do that. Between Copus and the Year of Science project, there are just all sorts of ways that you can get involved in this year especially. Doing this sort of outreach in the communities reminds teachers that evolution is important and reminds them that they have a constituency. 30% of them are getting pressure from administrators or parents not to teach evolution. How many of them are getting pressure to teach evolution? How many of them are hearing from parents, why aren't you doing this? If you've got kids in the schools, that's an easy way to start. Just say, hey, you teach evolution, right? So, by doing all of these things, we can build a constituency for accurate evolution education, using all of these things, and give teachers the freedom to follow Dobzhansky's maxim.
Thank you.
There's a hand at the back that went up immediately. Yeah, so the question was, first of all, about outreach to television and about outreach to medical doctors. And I had a line in there that I managed to skip over about, pre-meds and medical school students should definitely have required courses in evolution. There's a growing field of evolutionary medicine that students should definitely be exposed to before they go out and are practicing, definitely. And TV is great. I mentioned the press very briefly. The television media are definitely a big part of that. And something like 60% of the public gets most of their news, or if not all of it, from local television news, which local TV news is worse than national broadcast news in most cases. I'm not singling any particular stations out, obviously. So, but they don't have the time, they don't have the expertise. Reporters are not scientists. Almost 90% of the time, they're not scientists by training. So when they're interviewing you, it's a great chance to practice. How do you explain evolution? How do you explain science in a way that makes sense to people? And if they learn that you are a good person on film, good person to talk to, they'll come back to you. And that's a great way to reach a lot of people who may think that evolution is nonsense or who don't understand everything that's happened in evolutionary biology in the last 150 years, let alone the last couple of decades. Jay? The question was about pointing out that our Voices for Evolution has hundreds of statements and that science is not really speaking with one voice in a way that directly counters the creationist approach. And that's the nature of science in a lot of ways. Scientists are a fractious bunch. It's hard to herd any large group of scientists to do any one thing. So I don't know what the solution to that is. It's a good point, and to the extent that AAAS is the largest scientific society in the world, the fact that it has a statement out strongly supporting the teaching of evolution. The National Academies of Science have strong statements in there also. To the extent that science speaks with one voice, it's through those sorts of organizations. But ultimately, it's through the scientific literature. And at the end of the day, people can do this themselves. When people say, oh, evolution is on its way out, okay, go to PubMed. Put in evolution. What do you find there? That's the voice of science. And it's a lot of voices speaking as one in favor of evolution. Thanks.
Thank you, Josh.